everybody. How are you doing, Nina? How are you guys doing tonight?
Welcome to yet another fun-filled episode of the Winter Latina show, where we discuss exciting things like foreign policy, history from 1,000 years ago, and death and destruction of military campaigns. And I know this is this is quickly becoming your favorite show in the world. We intend for you to like, share, subscribe, and do all the things, which of course we truly appreciate on all the socials, all the platforms. And today we have a special guest who is a Serbian-American writer and historian based in Serbia, Nebojša Malić. I apologize for butchering the name. As a Slav, I should be able to pronounce it better than a non-Slav, but sometimes there are, even I can be imperfect. And our topic today is the very unfortunate 25th anniversary of NATO's 78-day nightmarish campaign over the former Yugoslavia from March to the summer of 1999. And of course, we'll discuss that in a little bit more detail, but we do want to understand the bigger context. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of the region and, of course, the build-up to that situation in the 90s, which had precedents, for instance, in 1995 with NATO's involvement. And we also want to touch upon the idea of NATO basically finding its raison d'être, pardon my French, and I mean that literally. I know this is like a dad joke. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, it was really that organization, that so-called defensive organization, was struggling to find a reason to exist. And through its campaigns in the Balkans, it did. So, Marcelo, again, you're sort of a little bit of an outsider, but at the same time, you've kind of witnessed these events in real time. So I kind of want to know your perspective before Nebojša can jump into discussing what happened in the 90s and, of course, the historical background thereof.
Well, just today we were talking. I was talking to Kivorka Malsian from the Syrian Analysis channel, and one of the things that we went through when we were talking about Armenia is that people have been used to having the world, the countries as they are for a long time, quote unquote, already. And many young people, especially, just think that the world cannot change like that. And I was born in 81. I'm going 43 this year. And when I was very young, we faced the collapse of the Soviet Union and the division of the Soviet Union into several mini countries. And that's just in my lifetime, of course.
But of course, there are other divisions going on, like in the now former Yugoslavia, sort of on a smaller scale, but
exactly,
no less complicated. Probably more in some ways.
Exactly, but not only Yugoslavia dissolving, but many other ex-Soviet republics. And now we are just watching Ukraine being, kind of dissolved as well, and
sure,
probably will be. And we have the West Asia situation with Gaza and Israel. There is a high probability that either things get on track or even Israel may cease to exist as a geographical limitation of a country. And, not too long ago, we kind of lose this perspective that not too long ago, African countries were colonies.
Of course.
And today, we still have in South America.
The late 80s. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And today, we still have in South America the French Guiana, which is not a country, it's a colony. They just call it a different name, but it is a colony, you know? And, well, in school, we used to learn about, the geography of in geography and history, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, all those things. But after that, we did not we ceased to pay attention to what was going on in Eastern Europe and things that are not interesting for us to know about.
Well, directly sort of in your line of vision. But at the same time, do you remember seeing headlines from the 90s about the NATO involvement in the Balkans in 1995 in Bosnia? Do you remember headlines from 1999, or you were not so tuned into as a young metalhead into sort of foreign policy events around the world?
Well, for me, it was also in Brazil. We were always taught to read the newspaper. You had to read the newspaper,
of course.
But when I was a teenager, I was trying to start to read the newspaper, and I was basically reading bullshit. And I decided, okay, why should I get more stupid? I just better not learn at all about anything. And I also said about this in the Kevork show today. I always say this in the channel. Most of people, we just have to take care of our lives. We have to go to work, we have to go on vacations, we have to take care of our friends, our family, and stuff like that. That's already too time consuming. All right. And getting tuned in what is going on in Yugoslavia for a Brazilian, I mean, it's an ocean away.
Sure.
We are in a different rock.
For me, before I had an interest, sort of a detailed interest in international relations and foreign policy, my parents had brought us to Canada, sort of fleeing the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And there were other ways of, I was an immigrant, but there were ways of refugees, right, fleeing war zones, coming to Canada. So Rwanda, Somalia, and the other place was, of course, the Balkans, people coming from various parts of the Balkans. So sort of late 90s, early 2000s, you could meet a lot of, in my case, I've met Serbs. And we didn't really discuss this topic because, well, first of all, it was a sensitive subject. At the same time, you would kind of hear comments here and there that were very telling to me, how someone had witnessed something really, really horrific. And of course, they wouldn't really want to talk about this. So this is kind of how I was interested in this subject in the first place, by having these direct interactions with the diaspora coming into North America. And so, of course, Nebojša here is technically a diaspora member, although you're happily back in Serbia. So I really would like to hear your perspective, and perhaps you could maybe summarize what happened in the 90s, but then we really do want to have a brief look at the historic roots of some of those conflicts that arose in your region.
Okay, so without further ado, let me bring Nebojša to the channel.
Yes, let's bring him to the channel. Just
give me a second, because I have to be sure that I have yeah. Okay. Now I think it should be all right. I will check the audio because we had problems before, but I think
make
it's
sure
all right.
that all the Twitter is audible.
Exactly.
Is audible.
I'm over there to check that. So, welcome, Nebojša.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay?
No, I can definitely hear you. I think Marcelo is just going to check to make sure that it's feeding to everyone who's listening to us right now, especially it's going. Okay, perfect.
Well, I believe the technical term for what I am right now is a repat, even though I've I've sort of gone about it the circuitous way. I'm originally from Sarajevo, present-day Bosnia. I had a front row seat to the war there that broke out in 92 when I was 15. And I left in early 96 and ended up in the US, where I've been until very recently, just a couple of months ago. Starting in 1999, I actually got involved in the politics of the wars because of the NATO bombing of then Yugoslavia, present-day Serbia, and Montenegro. And so that's sort of been my career. That's what got me into journalism, really, and kind of how I ended up in this line of work. I mean, where to begin?
So would you say that these sort of personal experiences were extremely formative, not just to your identity as a person, but also, like you're saying, professionally, that you might not have been in this field had it not been for those personal experiences.
Absolutely. I got my start in journalism in Bosnia in '95, and then sort of dabbled in various other things while in college, and then ended up going right back to it in '99 because it was directly affecting me and my relatives, and ended up staying. Life is what happens while you're making other plans, really. And sometimes
what is that expression? Man plans and God disposes. No, it's supposed to rhyme. I forgot what it's
Man proposes, God disposes.
Man proposes, God disposes. Yeah, exactly. This is kind of man proposes, NATO disposes in this particular case. Well, why don't we briefly summarize this campaign and the destruction from it, and then we'll go back into, I'm assuming we want to go back a little bit to the 19th century to briefly have a look at that region.
Right. So can I take about 30 seconds to 2 minutes?
Go ahead.
Yes, you can pull a Putin. You're welcome to do that. We're fellow Putinists in that sense, that we like history, so for sure.
So the bombing started on the 24th of March, local time, in the evening. And NATO's official objective was to impose the so-called Rambouillet peace agreement, which was an ultimatum named after a French chateau, where this Munich-like diplomatic farce took place earlier that month. And it was essentially the Air Force on behalf of the so-called Kosovo Liberation Army, which is an ethnic Albanian separatist group that had until recently been recognized as terrorists by the Americans themselves.
I believe it was literally up until '98. So it was like a year prior, which is amazing.
Yeah, and then in like September, October '98, they removed him from the terrorist designation, sent Richard Holbrooke to sit down on the floor with them, and basically endorsed them and their struggle. And in fact, just yesterday, I believe, then Senator Joe Lieberman, who infamously said that the KLA fights for American values, he just passed away.
Right.
But that was one of his famous comments about the ethnic Albanian cause. And he's been their supporter for many years. So what NATO did was they expected another Desert Storm or deliberate force, which was the name of their operation in Bosnia, and it didn't work. And in fact, just 2 days into the campaign, they lost an F-117. 3 days into the campaign, it was the 27th. The couple of F-16s got shot up pretty badly. In fact, the future Secretary of the Air Force, David Goldfein, was flying one. Things were not going well. And in fact, just recently dug up British secret documents show that the Brits were absolutely losing it and were trying to persuade Americans to send in ground troops somehow. But the biggest problem is that nobody wanted to be the staging area for them because Hungarians, Bulgarians, and Romanians were not in NATO yet. They would join later. The Greeks had absolutely no interest in doing this because they already were facing a mutiny in their ranks over bombing their fellow Orthodox brethren. And the Albanians, the actual country of Albania, was like, yeah, we don't want to do that and face Serbian reprisal. Now, officially, there's never been any sort of reprisal. Officially, there was never any cross-border involvement. Unofficially, the stories I've heard, including a novel by this longtime Serbian military correspondent who ended up becoming an ambassador to Russia, and then tragically died of sudden and unexplained heart condition a couple of years back. He had written that in a novel, obviously, so artistic license, that the Yugoslav Air Force actually carried out a preemptive strike on the airport near Tirana, where the American Apache helicopters were stationed, and wrecked a whole bunch of them. And that the NATO savagely bombed the airport from which they came the day later, which has been documented. So it's one of those Glomar situations. Nobody can either confirm nor deny it. But the fact is, the Apaches never flew a combat mission, and they attributed several of their losses to hitting power lines in northern Albania, which are not really there. So make of that what you will. Long story short, for 78 days, NATO keeps bombing and achieving absolutely nothing. The Yugoslav military ends up getting out with nary a scratch. They were shocked when they finally retreated from the province. And they were expecting 300 tanks destroyed. And it turns out that they were blowing up old American World War II tank destroyers that were disguised as modern tanks because they were using Maskirovka to the level nobody's ever seen before. So what NATO ended up doing was they ended up hitting civilian targets. They hit marketplaces, schools, hospitals, killed a whole bunch of children, bombed a passenger train. There's a long list.
Chinese embassy.
Yeah, they blew up the state TV building, and still standing, just like it's been destroyed for the past 25 years. It's been preserved as a monument.
Yeah.
The rest of the building functions normally. It's just that the bomb out part is just sort of still a ruin. They hit the general staff, which was completely emptied out, but they destroyed it. Now there's talk of Serbian government giving it to Jared Kushner to build a luxury hotel, which everybody here hates the idea. I mean, they wouldn't necessarily mind, the depleted uranium being cleared out of the area, but it's and that's been a lingering effect. I mean, there's places that got hit really hard where there's been birth defects and cancer through the roof, and all of these.
I apologize for interrupting, Marcel. I sent you that link yesterday that apparently, when those lawsuits were still being launched about the use of depleted uranium and the very strong links to cancer was a couple of years ago, that there was that parallel with the Italian soldiers being stationed in Kosovo, having, I think, about 500, there was like 500 cases of cancer as well. So there was also that interesting side effect, quote unquote, that collateral damage to NATO's own soldiers from using that kind of ammunition.
Well, does everybody remember the Gulf War syndrome?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
A whole lot of American troops reported feeling mysteriously ill after that, and this was the first conflict in which this kind of ammunition was widely used. And they were using these tank busters against the Iraqi vehicles that literally have these special bullets that were armed with depleted uranium penetrators. That's how they could punch through the armor. Mm-hmm. They're like 30 millimeter rounds, and all of these soldiers that were climbing all over the destroyed Iraqi tech were inhaling this dust from depleted uranium, and they were getting sick because by itself, it's not necessarily radioactive. You can handle it in your hand if it's intact, but once it punches through armor, it spalls off particles, and these particles, if inhaled, basically emit either alpha or beta radiation, and I'm not 100% clear on that, but not the gamma stuff. But this is the more dangerous stuff that literally disrupts cellular structure if ingested or inhaled, and a lot of people did that.
And so we have effects now 25 years that are still being felt, which is, we talk about landmines, right, being left in places for decades, and, for instance, Southeast Asia, right, or Africa. Now it's going to be Ukraine. But this is one of those sort of silent, invisible killers that, other than perhaps a handful of news media from Serbia and Russia, you don't really get a lot of media coverage of that, although the effects are obviously quite horrific. So, Nebojša, it sounds to me, based on what you're describing, that this was more almost like this campaign of punishment going after civilians having had these unsuccessful incidents like what you're describing. How do you view it?
Well, I mean, a lot of people were reminded of Hitler's bombing in 1941 because he called his attack on Yugoslavia Operation Strafgericht, Operation Punishment. It was essentially vengeance for Yugoslavia rejecting the tripartite pact because its government was strong-armed into signing it on March 25th, 1941. And then 2 days later, there was a popular uprising. There was a coup. People were like, no, we're not going to be allies with the Germans. Are you crazy? We were enemies in the last World War. And they overthrew the government. And now there's been stories about the English Secret Service getting involved and bribing officers and so on. Honestly, Serbian people would have done it without the British. There was no love for the Germans. There was a handful of officers who believed that the Germans were so super powerful because of what they did to the French that, people should bend the knee and go along to get along. They were a minority, and to this day, they are still wrong.
Was there that public perception then in 1999 of comparing it to essentially World War II?
Absolutely. There were comparisons of NATO with the Nazis. There was the Nazi attack happened on April 6th. The NATO attack came 10 days prior in this case on the calendar, but they were both bombing Belgrade for Easter. It was just one of those comparisons that wrote themselves. And, you had people assembling in public squares with signs, encouraging Monica Lewinsky to bite down, and drawing the NATO symbol with the tines of the compass rotated so they represent a swastika and so on. I mean, they were just really, protesting this and drawing targets on themselves and, basically sending a message of defiance.
Sure.
And
so what was the conclusion of this campaign in early summer of 99 after the 78 days of hell?
Right. So what ends up happening is one of those tricks of the diplomatic trade. Basically, Washington persuaded Moscow to persuade Belgrade that further fighting is pointless, and bluffed colossally, saying that, basically the next thing we're going to do is we're going to destroy all of your infrastructure and deliberately target civilians. And if you don't want your country erased off the map, better agree to an armistice. And actually, the armistice that was offered didn't seem too terribly bad. It was a back down from the original ultimatum. It was not a NATO occupation with guaranteed independence for this ethnic Albanian group. It was a UN-sponsored peacekeeping mission with Serbia's sovereignty fully guaranteed, with the UN Security Council resolution, and a NATO-led force, which now included a Russian paratrooper battalion that made this daring dash to the Pristina airport. And there was this tacit understanding that the Russians may not even have their occupation zone, so to speak, but would at least be involved. And that was enough to persuade Belgrade that, okay, we can end this on honorable terms because we don't want people to die.
Of course.
We're quite a bit outgunned and outmatched, but at the same time, they haven't beaten us.
Right. Well, we should also mention that Russia was in a very weak position, because I know you still hear comments 25 years later, why didn't it intervene earlier?
It couldn't.
It couldn't. It was experiencing its own neoliberal collapse, right? The first Chechen war going into the second Chechen war. So it was really in probably the weakest position in decades. But, we always mention that famous turn over the Atlantic with Primakov, the then prime minister, who was flying to Washington on March 24th, the day of the start of this insane campaign. And he was supposed to sign various agreements in Washington, and he turned the plane around midair. So this was sort of, and it's a small gesture, but it's kind of become this famous symbol of non-compliance with this new hegemonic world order that was being born in the 90s. And of course, this campaign is one of those focal points, right? A watershed for that particular moment. But yes, Russians really they were not in the position to do really much other than perhaps be involved in diplomacy, like you mentioned.
Well, you said watershed moment. I mean, Primakov's flight was scheduled. Basically, the bombing started after he took off, and it was deliberately timed for that, according to these newest released documents, because the Americans figured if he was already flying to Washington, he's not going to turn back. And he did. And not only did he turn back, Russia turned around within 6 months. Because when you look at what happened in 99, Yeltsin gives his famous end of the year speech, resigns, hands the country over to Putin, and then the rest is history. I mean, smarter men than me and better informed men than me have basically said, this was the moment where Russia turned and decided, no, we've seen the real face of the West. We're not going to accept this at face value, which is ironic because a few years later, you had Strobe Talbot, the point man for Russia for the Democrats at the State Department, Clinton's top Russia hand, do this introduction to a book by a fellow named John Norris, who was one of his staffers, who then went to International Crisis Group, one of these Soros shops. And Norris wrote a book about how this was really all about just a message to Russia, that it had nothing to do with the Albanians and nothing to do with Serbia. It just had to, they just had to break a country to show the Russians that the neoliberal world order cannot be challenged. It's here to stay.
We've only bombed a couple thousand civilians, and I know estimates range pretty broadly, but I would go with perhaps the higher, seeing the images of the destruction, the level of destruction. Yeah, we've only bombed a couple thousand civilians to send a message to Russia, which is
just like Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yes, exactly. We're just gonna nuke Hiroshima and Nagasaki to show the Soviet Union that we have this new very peachy weapon that you should be cognizant of and act accordingly. So yeah, it's
but
very,
just like that, it backfired because it only made Stalin want the bomb. And in this case, and set off the Cold War. And in this case, Russia got the complete opposite message of what the U.S. intended. And this is, fast forward 25 years, and we have what we have now. And nobody can convince me that Yugoslavia was not directly involved in this.
So basically, what you're telling us that that may sound crazy, but what you're telling us is that all these genius plans from the West never worked. I just stupid. Okay.
It's the
I
Wile
just want to be sure that's the conclusion of this.
Well, it's the Wile E. Coyote plan to catch the Roadrunner. They always backfire. But no, it's like I'm not the one who wrote this book. Norris and Talbot did, and they said what their intention was. I mean, I've read Richard Holbrooke's memoirs in '98 about how he, made peace in Bosnia with the Dayton Agreement, and it was blatantly obvious that they misunderstood the conflict in Bosnia completely, and they didn't care because they just used the Bosnian Muslims and later the Croats, whom they described as junkyard dogs, way to respect somebody, as a weapon. And then the whole point of there was this whole cynical thing. I think this is when I soured on American diplomacy, even before the Yugoslav war, was basically reading Holbrooke's whole explanation of how this war was really about asserting American dominance in Europe and, showing the world that we are back. And because there was this whole period after 91, the reunification of Germany, end of the Cold War, the Soviet Union basically surrendered and ushered in the era of, end of history, peace and prosperity, right? And then the Americans were like, wait a second, but if people are not afraid, why would they need us? And they had to come up with an excuse to have, tens of thousands of troops in Europe and all these military bases. And so they latched onto Bosnia. Today is the 28th is the anniversary of the infamous meeting between the American ambassador in Bosnia and the Bosnian Muslim leader at the time, when he essentially advised the Muslim leader to unsign the peace agreement that he had achieved with the Serbs and Croats living in that particular former Yugoslav republic, because there was an ethnic partition agreement that would have made war unnecessary. And Izetbegovic, the Bosnian Muslim leader, was like, well, I don't like it. And the American ambassador, Warren Zimmerman, allegedly, according to his Canadian colleague who spoke to me about this personally, said, well, if you don't like it, you shouldn't sign it. Implying, just like the ambassador in Iraq implied to Saddam Hussein, that, do whatever you want, we'll have your back, or we won't intervene. And obviously, Saddam Hussein found out the hard way that the ambassador lied. And Izetbegovic found out the hard way that the Americans didn't really have his back. He thought for years that they would intervene on his side, just like they did in Kuwait, and that never happened.
Well, there are lots of parallels to Ukraine right now. I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely.
I know. With sort of more technical issues like human shields, right? Russians using Donbass civilians as human shields, Serbians using human shields, right? But also sort of grander questions of how fully will they intervene on, behalf of Zelensky, on behalf of the Bosnian Muslim leader, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, I think the parallel to Iraq is really interesting because if you look at the 99 bombing, it was, of course, our favorite Madeleine Albright who, quote, I'm reading this from a history book, pushed the hardest for military bombings of all sort of the key people in the U.S. State Department. And then, of course, we know how involved she was with, the Iraq situation, right? The famous quote about 500,000 children being worth it. That still gets passed around even after she passed herself. But I think you touch upon a very important sort of the key role here, where after the collapse of the Soviet Union and dissolution of the Warsaw Pact, NATO kind of had this moment of, should we even exist, right? Our main opponent is gone. It's gone peacefully. Gorbachev, for reasons that boggle my mind, just pulled out of Germany, et cetera, et cetera. And so what is the point of having these massive military, collective security organization? And if you actually, again, this is according to someone like Ambrose and Brinkley, key American historians, Clinton in his first presidency was not so much interested in foreign policy compared to other presidents. But then, of course, by the late 90s, he was very much involved, right? And of course, you had, this involvement in the Balkans. You also had the, parallel to this NATO expansion, which the Russians kept protesting but had no way of really challenging at this time. So you basically have NATO getting this, second life by, in part, and you could sort of debate to what extent it created these issues that it then presented itself as a solution to, that famous Richard Sacco quote, what is it? NATO exists to challenge NATO exists to basically solve the problems that are created through its existence. Yeah, I'm paraphrasing right now. But basically, it's kind of like advertising where you don't even think there's a problem, and then advertiser comes on, your cable television and presents you this solution to a problem that you didn't even know was there, and now you're really worried about the problem. Well, NATO here, it could be strongly argued, would create these problems, like you're talking about, getting rid of an agreement that would have been pretty peaceful in terms of sort of ethnic borders in that particular part of the world. And and then it is the one that presents itself as a solution through fear mongering and military engagement, and obviously a large civilian death toll. But what I'd like to do is go back a little bit, pull a Putin, and maybe briefly look at perhaps starting with the 19th century. I know Serbia is obviously an ancient country with a long history, but we don't have quite the time for that. Maybe we'll do something like this a little bit later. But why are there these divisions in the first place? I know it's a very complicated question, but I think having the imperial borders of the 19th century would be helpful. And of course, sort of the rise and fall of the Ottomans, for instance, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right. That would be helpful for us to understand a little bit better.
I'm not going to go back in time to Rurik and the founding of the
Where is your folder with all the quotes? Where is your folder with a massive book of quotes?
It's actually still in the boxes that are in the hallway.
Okay, next time we'll do this.
Makes sense.
But okay, the long and short of it is that basically you have the medieval Balkan states that arose in between the fall of the Roman Empire and the fall of Byzantium. That's a nice little 1,000-year span right there. But at one point, the Ottoman Turks emerge in Anatolia and basically take out most of Byzantium and cross over into the Crusades' weakened Balkans. You had the Fourth Crusade sacking Constantinople in 1204. And
we still remember.
To this day, the East remembers.
To this day, yes, we do.
But and so they make their way to the Balkans. They're checked for about 75 years by the Serb resistance. But of course, they come back and the Serbs haven't been able to rebuild because the Hungarians swoop in from the north. And there's been this constant push and pull between the Orthodox and the Catholics ever since the schism. And then the Islam moves into the mix. And so by like the 1500s, you basically have the Balkans divided between Austria-Hungary, well, Habsburg-ruled Hungary, whatever,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
The Venetians along the coast, and the Ottomans. And this is sort of the borders shift a little bit here and there, but this remains the situation up until the late 1700s, early 1800s. And then the modern era really begins not after the French Revolution, but with the uprising of Serbs in 1804, for the Balkans anyway. Essentially, there's the Grand Serb Rebellion led by Black George Petrovic, called Karađorđe, accidentally. I mean, there's this group of janissaries that sort of set up their own private fiefdom and start oppressing people, and they decide that the best way to calm down the protesting Serbs is to execute their village leaders and start killing them. And of course, some of them escape. And start a resistance, and it's a very Game of Thronesy. Before George Martin ever had that idea, you could really make a grim TV series out of this. And so the Serbs revolt and successfully defeat the Turks for about a decade. Unfortunately, by 1812, the Russians who have been supporting them, the French have been supporting the Turks. It was a nice proxy war for both powers. In 1812, what happens is Napoleon invades Russia, and the Russians are a little preoccupied. So the Turks use this opportunity to move back in. The Janissaries are already killed by the rebels, so that's one problem less for the Sultan to deal with. But now he has these Christians rebelling against the rightful Muslim authority, and they're like, you can't have that. So he sends this massive army, defeats the rebels, builds a tower of their skulls, and then crushes this thing in blood and starts repression anew, which again, within 3 years causes another rebellion. And now it's 1815. The Congress of Vienna has happened. Napoleon's been defeated. The Turks don't have a foreign proxy again, or a foreign ally.
The Congress of Vienna was like this new world order that existed up until World War I. So
for about 100 years more. Well,
yeah,
not
very
quite,
important. Yeah,
not quite. There was an interlude in 1878, and I'll get to that in a minute.
Well, the Crimean War as well. But I would mention that one, even though it was a smaller.
Of course. So what ends up happening is that Russia's all of a sudden Russia and Austria are all of a sudden predominant continental powers. And the closest thing the Ottoman Empire has to a foreign protector is Britain, which slowly works its way into this through the Greek uprising. Like, the British were in favor of the Greeks at first. But then when Russia got too strong, they were like, wait, no, great game. And that influences policy in Europe as well. And so you have throughout the 19th century, you've got these great powers jockeying over the Balkans, because the British, and to a lesser extent the French, want the Ottoman Empire to survive as a bulwark between their colonies in the Middle East and Africa and India and Southern Asia and the Russians.
And of course, the key point for British foreign policy is not to allow a major continental power to rise and challenge them. So sometimes it's Germany, a lot of times it's Russia. So that's another sort of key, the great game, obviously.
They were so obsessed with checking Russia that they missed the rise of Germany. And so they had to reorient their foreign policies after 1871 and 1878 to make an alliance with the Russians against the Germans, which... yeah, but we're moving too far ahead. So basically what starts happening is that the Serb uprising starts inspiring other uprisings. And then you have the Greeks in 1820, which they eventually succeed and they start expanding their territory. And then you have in the 1850s, that process slows down because of the Crimean War. The English and the French wanted to check the Russians, and so they do that. And they help the Ottomans, and they keep trying to prop up the Ottoman Empire. And then you have this 1870s hostilities that flare up again, what the British have been nibbling off Egypt and so forth. And so the Bulgarian, first of all, what starts the whole thing is a rebellion of Serbs in Herzegovina, which is the southern part of present-day Bosnia-Herzegovina, which spreads and has Serbia and Montenegro at that point, semi-dependent principalities declare war on the Ottomans. Then there's a rebellion in Bulgaria, present-day Bulgaria. The Ottomans start repression, and then Western powers get involved. Russians get in, and they essentially drive to present-day Istanbul, or Constantinople, as we prefer to call it, at which point the English and the Austrians, the English and the French panic. The Austrians, who were at that point allied with the Russians, say, well, we don't want to get involved. We just got our butts kicked by the Germans, and we're no shape to do anything. And why should we help you? We want piece of the action ourselves. Mm-hmm. And then you get the Congress of Berlin in 1878, which essentially revises the outcome of that war to steal Russia's gains, to partition Bulgaria, to give a little bit of land to Serbia, and let Austria sort of move into Bosnia, which was an Ottoman province, and occupy the area called the Sanjak of Novi Pazar, which would physically separate Serbia from Montenegro, because the biggest fear is if these two ethnically Serb principalities get connected and then get an exit to the sea, there's no taking them out. That's just a hard wall between Austria and the rest of the Balkans, and the Austrians, having been defeated everywhere, Italy, Germany towards Russia, because they got Galicia, and that's it. They can't move east, they can't move north, they can't move west. So the only way for their colonial expansion is the Balkans. And so they have their eye on Serbia. They install, they basically make a secret pact with the Serbian prince so he can become king but be a vassal. And everything seems to be moving more or less swimmingly in that respect. And then there's a coup in Belgrade in 1903 in which that dynasty is overthrown because they did a couple of things, more than a couple of things, that ended up being a combination of corruption and nepotism that annoyed the military so much that they were like, we're not having any of this. And the king and the queen end up assassinated, chopped with sabers, thrown out the window of the palace into the garden, which I pass by every day going to work. And the next dynasty comes in, and I sort of glossed over the fact that like the first uprising was led by Karađorđe. The second uprising was led by another village prince called Miloš Obrenović, who was actually in a kinship relationship with Karađorđe. They were best man. Karađorđe baptized his son or something. It's a Serbian institution that I have trouble translating into English because there's no cognate, but they were essentially related through faith, through religion, like Godfather type thing. And Miloš committed a cardinal mortal sin of having Karađorđe killed and his head sent to the Sultan as a condition of making peace. And so, a lot of Serbs believe that dynasty's been cursed from that day.
Oh, interesting. Okay. And
because none of them, except Miloš himself, actually peacefully finished out their rule. Like, his nephew, his son was assassinated, his nephew went into exile, and, his grandnephew ended up getting thrown out the window. If I'm getting my Serbian kings right. I need to check that. But anyway.
If you thought your country was complicated, look at this, like I said, Game of Thrones type scenarios.
The Serbs are said to have an excess of history.
So if we were to sort of summarize the 19th century, which sounds, very difficult, up through to World War I guess we could say that there was the slow decline of the Ottoman Empire, and as it was being propped up by other powers, right, such as Britain. Mm-hmm. And there was this liberation movements in part in Orthodox lands. And of course, from the Russian perspective, yes, they did have geopolitical interests, but they did have that religious feature to those conflicts as well. It's kind of hard to just completely discount this protection of, the Orthodox brothers. Yeah. And so there are all these countries that eventually end up gaining independence, like Bulgaria, that unfortunately has been siding with Nazi Germany or the Bulgarian government, I should say, with Nazi Germany or NATO countries since then. But basically, there are all these countries that in part gained independence thanks to these sort of great conflicts between the great powers, but also Russia's interest in protecting the Orthodox population at this time.
Right. So we fast forward to 1912. This is a watershed year. The Serbian kingdom at the time is basically at odds with Austria, which has annexed Bosnia in 1908, contrary to the actual Congress of Berlin. Talk about a unilateral annexation, right? Sort of upended that order. And so at that point, 30 years after the Congress of Berlin, the order that was established there is now null and void. And it's a free-for-all between great powers. And it's just a question of who's going to trigger something when. In 1912, there's this Balkan alliance with Serbia, Bulgaria, Montenegro, and Greece, mediated by the Russian emperor, given the blessing of the Russian emperor, that starts a war on the Turks with the explicit goal of liberating the rest of their captive brethren and finalizing this process of liberation. And if they drive on to Constantinople, so much the better.
Well, this is the key goal that was interrupted by World War I and revolution. Right. So we remember that too.
Right. But what happens is they literally defeat the Turkish field army. The Serbs take it out single-handedly. The Greeks march up to Thrace. The Bulgarians arrive to present-day Edirne, where they lack siege artillery, so the Serbs have to lend them a hand. And the Serbs and Montenegrins emerge onto the sea. And then the Austrians get involved. And what they say is basically the Austrians and the British say, oh, we're going to invade you if you don't stop and if you don't make room for an independent Albania. And the Austrians hastily draw up the Albanian flag, codify the Albanian alphabet, and basically I'm grossly oversimplifying this, invent the Albanian nation out of a proto-nation that was emerging under the Ottomans, which was sort of a majority Muslim proxy enforcer in this particular region. They were like the only majority. You had your local converts, and the present day Bosnian Muslims or Macedonian Turks and the Bulgarian Pomaks, but you didn't have such a core. They understood that they were part of the people that they came from. They spoke the Serbian language, for lack of a better phrase, or Bulgarian. Whereas these people spoke a completely different language. They reportedly came from somewhere in the Caucasus and were settled there by the Ottomans to replace the depopulated population, and basically became their enforcers. And there's been a Turco-Albanian conflict there. Again, I'm grossly oversimplifying this, but essentially the Albanians end up being this remnant of the Ottoman order that the Austrians take over sponsoring. And this is what starts off a conflict between them and the Serbs and the people of Montenegro and the Greeks ever since.
So if you had to, again, grossly oversimplify, to what extent was it these imperial divisions and some of this social engineering versus actual ethnic strife that prompted future conflicts like the one in the 90s?
I would say 90% imperial divisions, 10% at genuine ethnic strife, because a great part of ethnogenesis in the 19th century throughout the Balkans, I'm not even, I'm again talking about like modern day Croatians or Bosnian Muslims that Austrians tried to make into a nation during their occupation. Their identities in great part depended on identifying with the imperial power. A great part of modern Croat identity, the faction that prevailed, was the we are Catholics and non-Serbs and we hate Serbs. This is how
a negative identity that we've seen in certain other parts of the world recently, right?
Exactly. And that particular identity that you're referring to also started under the Austro-Hungarians because they controlled that region.
You mentioned Galicia, yes.
Precisely. Basically, we're fighting the ghost of Austria-Hungary. Ironically, because Gavrilo Princip famously wrote a poem that said, our shades will wander the halls of Vienna, scaring the gentlemen and the courtiers. But it's in fact their specter that's still haunting Europe over 100 years since, because the things they did for ethnogenesis are with us to this day because of the way the world order was sort of canned and preserved in amber after World War I and World War II. But yes, 1914, I lived on the street originally where Princip shot Ferdinand.
Oh.
That was my neighborhood. He gets a lucky shot. The Archduke, who was actually, ironically, the opponent of war, gets removed from the board. And the war faction in Vienna takes over. And they're like, well, now is the time to attack because the Russians are weak. The Germans have our back. Nobody's going to interfere. We're just going to run Serbia over. And they fail twice.
And of course, we get that expression, some damn thing in the Balkans that has since been used, ad infinitum. So.
Ironically, they should have listened to Bismarck, but he was long dead by this point, and he was the one recommending an alliance with Russia. But no, instead, Kaiser Wilhelm decides to buddy-buddy with the Austrians and dooms Germany, essentially. But yeah, Germany eventually invades in 1915. The Serbian army is displaced. The country's occupied. Fast forward 3 years later, they break through on everybody calls it differently. Serbs call it the Salonika front. The English called it the Macedonian front. They basically wrecked the Bulgarian army, which had since joined the Central Powers because they were unhappy with the partition in 1913 because of the Austrian meddling over Macedonia and Albania. And so the Bulgarians defect to the Central Powers. They get wrecked. The Germans lose the front. Austria-Hungary completely unravels, in part thanks to the Italians as well. But this was, the great break. There's literally a monument in present-day Austria that says, the Serbian cavalry came this far and no further, thank God. Because had they reached Vienna, that city would have burned for the sheer amount of atrocities that the Austrians committed. And so,
Well, we have World War I as basically the graveyard of empires.
Right.
So would you say the countries that arose out of World War I, whether that was an equitable way to create these new states on the ashes of the empires, like what happened with Yugoslavia? What is your perception of that?
No, I think in retrospect, it was a horrific historical mistake. It was easy for us to say that now. At the time, I think the dynasty, the prince that de facto ruled Yugoslavia, because his father was basically getting old and he passed the reins of power to him as a regent, was like, okay, well, the Russian Empire is in chaos. The Bolsheviks are taking over. The Entente is blown. They can't really do anything. We must have a strong big state so that we would be able to defend ourselves from a resurgent of Austria-Hungary or Germany or the Turks. And so let's just, accept our brothers in language and different faiths and call it one big happy family and everybody's going to be great, right? Except this particular reasoning came about 80 years too late because the ethnogenesis was already complete. And he didn't understand this fact at the time. He thought he could just paper it over, decree that everybody's going to be brothers and let's just stop fighting and be friends as teachers woefully tried to do in cases of school bullying. And again, he did not understand this fundamental dynamic that a lot of this ethnogenesis was based on negative identities identifying with conquerors. And so King Alexander tries to create Yugoslavia and tries to make a military alliance with the French and the Czechs and the Romanians, the Little Entente, and that fails miserably by the fact that he got assassinated in 1934. And by the time World War II rolls around, Yugoslavia is torn internally because the Croat identity that's violently anti-Serb ends up emerging triumphant in the internal struggle. You have divisions of spoils, you have resentments, you have ethnic issues, you have religious issues. And the Germans, Serbia, which was much smaller and weaker in World War I, turns back 2 Austrian armies over the course of a year, and the Germans waltz through Yugoslavia in 12 days.
Wow.
Obviously it was attacked from every corner. The Bulgarians joined, the Hungarians joined, the Italians joined, but still 12 days. And then you have the additional tragedy of the Croatian puppet government that was set up basically starts a genocide of Serbs months before the Wannsee conference that decided on the final solution. They start killing these people. The mass killings start with knives and mallets and just brutal animal savagery that, honestly, they were worse than Bandera's people.
This is why sometimes when you have a small number of Croatians fighting on the side of the Kiev regime with, Azov and some of these other units or previously separate battalions, and there's very specific insignia that's being used, and it's from that particular period. So it's very interesting that you have the brutality of these underlings exceeding the brutality of the conquerors. Right?
Well, the Nazis were appalled because their mass murder was industrial, and they tried to present it as the civilized way of doing things with records and engines and so forth. And here we have these people who are literally pre-medieval in their tactics and enjoy the bloodshed. And again, there's testimonies of German envoys and generals who are complaining about this because it was feeding to resistance. And you had 2 resistances in Yugoslavia, both majority Serb. One was communist, one was royalist, and they fought. And at some point, they started fighting each other over what's going to happen next, because the royalists were waiting for the British to land, and the communists were waiting for the Soviets. And the Soviets came first, and the British betrayed the royalists. Surprise, surprise!
Yeah,
surprise!
Curse your sudden but inevitable betrayal.
Perfidious Albion! Come on, you've never done this before.
Right. And so you end up with a situation of 1945 where Yugoslavia gets reinvented, stitched together from this horrifically mutilated corpse into Soviet Union 2.0. And Tito, supposedly an ethnic Croatian, although there's various conspiracy theories that he might have actually been secretly Polish and stole the identity of an actual person, he puts it together and along the lines of Lenin's nationalities policy in the Soviet Union. So you have these republics.
Not a good policy.
No, it wasn't.
Which was a very bad policy overall.
Right, but whereas Stalin sort of checked the worst excesses of this with his reforms in the 40s that enabled the Soviet Union to survive, whatever you think of him otherwise, Yugoslavia had Leninism up till the very end. And essentially Tito set up these ethnic republics He set up 6 regions originally. He subpartitioned Serbia into Vojvodina, which just means duchy, in the north, the formerly Hungarian-held territories that didn't really have many ethnic Hungarians. They had Hungarians and ethnic Germans, but the ethnic Germans got pushed out in 45 as part of the big, post-war ethnic cleansing. And then you have Kosovo, which had a substantial Albanian population, but not a majority. And it became a majority through decades of repression against the Serbs that the communist regime benevolently oversaw. They weren't unaware. They just tolerated them because that was leading them to the desired outcome of weakening Serbs. Because again, present-day Serbia was majority royalist.
I think we should explain that Lenin's policy was to check Great Russian chauvinism, as he called, and of course he wanted to institute communist, cadres in the regions and amplify and sometimes even create sort of these new ethnicities. Again, I'm simplifying, like you did recently, at the expense of the Russian population. So it sounds like, I did not know this. This is new to me. It's very interesting that essentially it's a parallel to that of checking, the great Serbs and then amplifying these other ethnicities by, I guess, any means necessary.
Absolutely. And honestly, this policy lasted up until 1987.
Wow.
Because Tito died in 1980, but it continued by inertia. And we had a constitution in 1974 that turned Yugoslavia into a de facto confederacy, that every republic could do whatever it pleased up to secession. We had a situation in which literally, like, being a Serb in Serbia was unimaginable. You had to apologize for existing. In Bosnia, it was slightly different because the Serbs were needed to balance out the Croats and what became the Muslims, the present-day Bosniaks, that the name was bestowed upon them in 93. So again, the dynamics varied, but you had a situation where you had these...
for interrupting. So would you say how much in the Soviet Union, it didn't seem like with Lenin or let's say with Khrushchev, who released thousands of Banderites but didn't really engage in any social engineering afterwards to reform them, if that was even possible. Do you see with Yugoslavia, how much foresight was there in terms of these potential ethnic clashes, or was it just very sort of nearsighted regarding this is a way for us to maintain power as basically the Communist Party rule? How much foresight was there regarding this potential splintering, collapse, and ethnic strife in the future? With the Soviet Union, it didn't seem like there was much of that.
There wasn't any. Any. In my opinion, Tito set it up basically like après moi le déluge. He didn't care what would happen after his death. And you have to keep in mind that he ruled from 1945 to 1980, so 35 years. As an autocrat, essentially. And so there wasn't any sort of transition like you saw in the Soviet Union. You had Stalin and then Khrushchev and then Brezhnev and so on. No, it was just Tito throughout. And the original divisions were created as sort of a balance of power. You had to check on... They imposed this historical narrative in which the communists were the only virtuous people in World War II, and everybody else, from the Nazi-allied Croatian Ustasha to the Bosnian Muslims who joined the Waffen-SS to the Serbian royalists, were all bad, equally bad. Sort of a uravnilovka of guilt. And essentially, they would crack down the hardest on the royalists because they had the biggest problem for communist legitimacy.
Of course.
Whereas all these fringe ethnicities would be tacitly tolerated. Like Pavelić, they didn't go after Pavelić, the head of the Nazi Croatian state. He was actually assassinated by a royalist agent independently. And I mean, they would here and there, they would take somebody out who was too prominent, but it wasn't. And then, of course, the Americans latched onto these things just like the captive nations business in the Cold War, and they would nurture these Croatian nationalists and Albanian nationalists and so on and so forth. Because, just in case, if we need to break up Yugoslavia, here's what we can use. Just like they used Bandera himself with regards to the Soviet Union. So 1987, economic crisis of the 80s is rocking Yugoslavia, and there's repression by the ethnic Albanian authorities, and then of course lower levels of society against the Serbs in Kosovo. And this fresh Serbian apparatchik named Slobodan Milosevic is sent to basically disband a workers' strike. And he has this moment where the police starts beating up the striking workers, and he gets out and says, nobody's allowed to beat you. And he becomes a populist hero overnight. Mm-hmm. And he rides this wave of populism to 89 constitutional reforms. And basically, without ever understanding it, I don't think he ever quite figured it out. He unravels the basic Titoist concept of Yugoslav organization, which is Serbs bad. And once he unravels this, all of these other ethnicities that had their own bureaucracies, and no bureaucracies ever abolished itself, all of these other power centers are like, wait a second, if he changes his balance of power, that means that, we might not be as powerful, and we need to get out while the getting is good. And the moment arrives with the Soviet turmoil and the reunification of Germany, and Germany immediately, right away, moves on to Austria, and then on to backing Slovenia and Croatia into seceding. It was the Germans who actually started historical revisionism before the Americans. The Americans were reluctant at the time. And there's a faction within the State Department and the White House during the Bush the Elder administration to basically say, wait a second, the Europeans are doing an end run. We must preserve our hegemony. We must jump on this bandwagon and turn it into our favor. And that's how the Americans end up intervening in 92, 93, first diplomatically through subterfuge.
So it sounds like the Soviet Union was the domino that basically pushed everything else in more ways than one, right? With, like you're saying, this German influence that, again, I wasn't aware of. So
yeah, and ironically, the final decision of the European Arbitrage Commission, was a self-appointed bunch of business lawyers that declared Yugoslavia had self-dissolved.
Of course,
was based on the Belaveja agreement that Yeltsin struck with the Ukrainians and Belarus, essentially self-abolishing the Soviet Union against the will of the vast majority of its people. And they were like, oh, yeah, look at that. We're going to do that now. And they declared overnight that all of these regional administrative boundaries were immutable foreign borders, international borders. And that literally set off a war, because all of those Serbs that now found themselves in Croatia again, ruled by a government that was dead set on rehabilitating World War II Nazis. And the first thing it did was strip them of their status. Yeah, they weren't going to take this lying down. They weren't going to line up and go into the carts and the wagons and off to the caves to be slaughtered with hammers. No, they picked up weapons, obviously. And same thing happened in Bosnia. The moment the peace treaty was abrogated, the Serbs took up arms, Bosnian Muslims took up arms, Bosnian Croats took up arms, the Croatian army intervened, and then you have the war.
It's interesting, again, the parallel to the Soviet ethnic, well, not ethnic, but I guess there are Soviet Republican borders, right? There's that parallel of this is going to be the state border of a new state without any consideration of the people who are maybe left in this hostile environment. It was worse for, the Soviet Union, let's say, initially in places like Central Asia, where the Russians were definitely a minority, as opposed to Ukraine. Ukraine was more of like a slow burning cooker that had a little bit of help, or a lot of help, coming from the official Western establishment over time. But yeah, it's interesting how there was that parallel too. So what would you say are the biggest misconceptions about the 90s in the mainstream mind that has some interest in politics versus sort of the truth based on your research, based on your own experiences?
Well, again, like the simplified narrative of the 90s is that the Serbian government, led by Slobodan Milosevic, was evil, nationalist, racist, fascist, whatever, also communist at the same time, that for no reason whatsoever attacked all of these peace-loving Democrats around them because it hated them for existing and wanted to steal their land that was rightfully theirs all along, and Serbs had no business invading them. And, the brave international community led by the United States arrived as a knight in shining armor and a white horse and brought peace and democracy and prosperity. And the only reason that they haven't taken roots in the 25 years since is that the evil Serbs keep sabotaging it. That's the mainstream narrative. And it's 100% false. Because again,
remember all these Time magazine headlines, like bringing Serbs to heel, like very, very aggressive. Not just bringing the government or like Saddam, right? It was specifically the Serbs, right? It was the overall painting of an entire people with this brush, which
and
is
I would
telling.
argue, right, and I would argue that this was part of a dehumanization campaign. They lifted the German propaganda straight out of the 1940s textbooks, but also a sort of a demonization of Russians by proxy, because again, in the minds of Anglophone media specifically, Serbs were basically Russians light, and you could say the nastiest, vilest things about them, and nobody would object. You know, you pick up any example of mainstream Western reporting about the Serbs and replace Serbs with any other ethnic group, literally any other ethnic group, and
you
it would be
fired for it.
Oh, it will be flagged as hate speech right away. But again, just as we saw 2 years ago, hate speech towards Russians is not just approved officially, but encouraged. You know, it's one of those. We were the designated enemy then. The Russians are the designated enemy now. And in fact, back in 2014, I flagged an article by a couple of these Russians that were on the payroll of National Endowment for Democracy. They were essentially saying, Putin is the new Milosevic. We should treat him the same way. Right. And I don't know whether they were just furthering a narrative that was already predetermined, but you will see that, like the American specifically policy towards Russia over the past couple of years, specifically since 2014, has literally been applying the Serbia recipe from the 90s and expecting the same result, which obviously hasn't worked.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen you comment on your X/Twitter kind of about these parallels, and it's very interesting that you've been picking up on it much earlier than other, at least from what I've seen, than other commentators that might have missed that.
I would like, because we are running for 1 hour, and I know that Nina today has a time limit. So I have one aluminum foil hat question.
Foil question.
It's super aluminum foil. And when I say aluminum foil, it's because, as I usually say here, I'm no journalist, okay? I'm doing this just because I'm pissed off with everything.
Which is a very good reason.
Legit. I agree with that. Yeah, perfect. So I'm not a super historian or super knowledgeable about history, which makes my mind kind of like a blanche painting.
A blank slate. It's a blank slate, yeah.
Exactly. So when I start seeing these things, when I started 2 years ago, when I started paying attention to geopolitics and history of region and everything, one thing that called my attention was the fact that I learned in early history school, that World War I, it's marked the start by the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which happened in Sarajevo.
In Nebojsa's hometown.
Yeah, exactly. My street.
Exactly. Your street. Fantastic. Send me a picture. I'm going to post it. So it happens in Sarajevo. And then we have, in at that time, that was Serbia, right? It was not Bosnia. It was
the Austrian-occupied Bosnia, yes.
Okay. And then all this thing. So where I'm going to is the following. What I'm seeing in the decision makers of nowadays wars and stupid decisions, that they don't use logic. They use some kind of feeling, hate or a vengeance or pride. I want to be. But I identify many people thinking like, I'm going to be the one that is going to beat this guy. I don't know. Call your name. Netanyahu. I'm gonna be the one that's going to do what no one did before me. Biden. I'm going to be the one that's going to destroy the Russians or whatever is in his mind. Probably not so much. When I was just mentioning before we started that I've been to a cruise ship where I met a Serbian guy, and he was telling me that he was probably on his 50s or something, and he was telling me that he didn't met peace until he was almost 40. But one thing that he told me that really marked, the words to me was that he said, Serbians we never give up a fight. We always resist. And when I see what happened in Belgrade in '99, which was by the time Yugoslavia, and then I keep seeing this Kosovo thing. What my perception is that, and this is the aluminum foil hat, there is people powers searching for vengeance. Vengeance for World War I, vengeance for Germany, vengeance for Serbians not giving up. And
my perception is we want to establish this extra military base. I guess I'm a little bit more practical, although I wouldn't
and that's where I say that this is practical and logical, and I don't think that's applied for the reasoning of these people.
Mm.
Well, so, there's definitely one of those. Yeah, go finish.
It's just because while you were talking and explaining all this at this time, many things were making even more sense on my line of thoughts, and at the same time, new lines started to be created. Like, for example, the religious fact. You mentioned the ethnic fact. So. How do you think all those facts point to Serbia at this?
Well, my people are notoriously stubborn. We are, and we have historically been freedom-loving, and our existence since the 1800s has created all sorts of problems for great powers, some more than most. But definitely, the British we've disrupted British designs. We've definitely disrupted Austrian designs. You could argue that we had a hand in destroying the Habsburg Empire more so than most. We've disrupted German, the Second and Third Reich to a great extent.
Stalin.
Yep, we've butted heads with Stalin. We didn't destroy the Soviet Union, but we've definitely created problems for the Soviet. And it's our existence as an independent nation, as a freedom-loving people who don't like to do what they're told, no matter who does the telling, is always going to be a thorn in the side of anybody whose imperial project relies on absolute obedience. And it's not necessarily religiously or ethnically or any other traditional sense motivated. If a Chinese empire were to be created, I imagine we would butt heads with the Chinese empire as well, because it's not about religion. It's about wanting to be left alone in our own country, in our own little corner of the world, which is beautiful, and we love it very much, and we're willing to fight for it against all comers.
Probably more freedom-loving, proven through blood, than some other people that claim to be freedom-loving, but haven't really had to face anything to the extent that the Serbs had to face over the past 200 years and more, right? So that's kind of an important point here too.
Yeah, again, it's one of those, people say, well, why couldn't we be like the Czechs? They have all this ancient architecture and all these, Central European, fancy civilized things. And I'm like, well, it's because they surrendered to everybody. After the 30 Years' War, you don't see that, the Czechs don't have any sort of, they're like, well, okay, the Germans march in, fine. The Austrians march in, fine. The Hungarians march in, fine. I'm not disparaging the Czech civilization. I'm disparaging their martial virtue.
Of course.
And it's like we don't have that. Even if we had that choice and we were never given it, it's not in our national character anymore, and it never really has been. Our national character ended up being defined through resistance to conquerors, whether it's the Ottoman Turks or the Hungarians or the Austrians or the Germans or whoever. And it's one of those, we are who we are, and you either live with that or we fight.
Well, Nebojša, perhaps we should do another episode on some of the more recent developments with Kosovo today, especially with Vučić's recent statements about, dark days ahead, something a little bit more recent. I think that would be really interesting to have you comment as someone who actually lives on the ground and sees some of the social mood and some of the more, applicable features that would be helpful for people who are not in Europe, and specifically in Southern Europe, to understand this. So you're welcome to come back, and if you're available and if you're comfortable, to talk about those as well.
I would love to.
Well, that would be fantastic.
That would be fantastic. Well, thank you for yet another history lesson that challenges Putin himself, even without the famous folder, even though we didn't go back quite 1,000 years. Maybe next time we'll do that. Thank you for watching, guys. I look forward to seeing your comments, whether you've actually learned something new like I did. And we're going to wrap it up, because this is one of those days where I got to run. I cannot, I wish I were permanently online, but it's not always possible. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, so thank you, everybody. Remember, all the links are on the description in our channel, to Nebojša Malić and Nina Bizantina, and to the Imprensa de Destruição em Massa, the press of mass destruction. Here, all the links on the description. Thank you, everybody, and have a nice day.
Thank you, guys.